Moving on, we're going to continue along the tangent of cybersecurity. It's such a vast topic and so relevant in the present era. 2 more minutes? Okay. This panel discussion resonates around a rather interesting topic: Internet of Things and cyber physical systems for smart cities. We are also connected today that it is safe to say our cities are evolving as a whole unit. The smarter we get, the more advanced our cities become. And to share with us the importance of such growth and its pros and challenges, we have a great lineup of panelists. I would like to call to the stage, is everyone here? Brian Grunkemeyer, CEO of FlexCharging, Vincent W. Allen, Managing Director of VAAV Industries, Paul Solano, CEO of 4E Consulting Group, and Saurabh Mukhrejee, ex-COO and member and co-founding management team at Atria Convergence Technologies. Let's give it up for our panelists.
Good morning, everyone. So, IoT and cyber-physical systems on a smart city context. Interestingly, how this thing has evolved from a simple home automations to a wide area automations to IoT and large public utilities based on cyber-physical systems. With increasing scope and scale brings more opportunities. It also brings more challenges and interesting areas to delve in the breadth and depth of this topic. So before we get into the details of it, I would request my expert team of panelists over here, Paul, Vincent, and Brian, to introduce themselves briefly, and we get into a few more Q&As.
Hi, I'm Brian Grunkemeyer, founder and CEO at FlexCharging. We integrate electric car charging with the power grid. We shift charging to the best time of day to keep EV charging green and cheap for everyone. And we just happen to use vehicle telematics and IoT to get there. So.
Hi guys, my name's Vincent Allen, Vincent W. Allen. I'm founder and managing director of VAAV Industries. We're a bespoke production, so broadcast engineering and audiovisual engineering company. We do a lot of work in the production space, but also integrating that kind of technology into your run of business, so your conference rooms, your meeting halls like the space we're sitting in today, and building out a lot of sort of in support of some of this IoT stuff we're going to talk about today, how you build out what we call an OCC, an operational command center for the local PD, the local fire department, private security for a large company, so they have eyes on everything they need to have eyes on, from the badge scanner at the front door to the security cameras to just everything in between, and we do a lot of that work.
Paul Solano. We at 4E work with several partners to design and develop solutions, mainly in the space of IoT, data analytics, trying to bridge the gap in between what we currently have as mainstream technologies and what the business and the markets need to achieve the new data models and the new operational models that are enabled through IoT.
I'm Saurabh Mukhrejee. I started a company through a private equity investment back in India in internet broadband space. And my experience in the smart city was to deploy and work very closely with the government in India to help them deliver smart city in some of the 20 different metropolis in India. And also from an academic assignment from MIT and Tsinghua University side, working with the Chinese government and looking at smart city implementation in the east of China. So interesting set of experiences within us, and let's get more deeper into it. IoT has obviously evolved. The CPS has evolved. It's the complementary systems, how they come and make the value chain work together. The sensors, the way network and communication happens, the data management, the data storage, and finally how the actuators work. Each of it has to evolve in isolation and in totality for things to work. Can I ask my distinguished set of panelists, What do you think are the evolutions happening in this space? For example, like the whole SCADA technology which was earlier. How is it evolving? Where is IoT headed as we speak?
But I can participate there a little. So we've been doing sensors and measuring things since we have technology and computers. The challenge has always been how to do that more and more, because at the end, the more we know about the physical world in which we work and move, the more we're capable of understanding it and modeling it so that we can do predictive analysis, right? Traditional automation technologies, SCADA systems and protocols in that area were the first enabler of that, but they were very narrow focused to certain industries or certain areas where usually were limited to the production manufacturing space, right? Or let's say the pipelines or drilling processes, etc. So what IoT brings on the table is a set of open new technologies to enable us to do that at scale that was not available before, in a much faster and easier way to integrate to other systems, and actually more secure than it used to be. Actually, one of the greatest problems with the traditional automation technologies were that they were not meant to be secure. They were meant to be isolated, right? So you usually will see that these systems exist in their own little network because everybody's afraid to plug anything to it and some third party cracking into your production line, right? So, or your electric network, right? So I think there is a massive evolution, and we are seeing it every day. All of our customers, with my partners in the automation space, we work constantly in conversation on how they move from the traditional SCADA technologies, Modbus, OPC, etc., into standard-based MQTT communications and more flexible integration patterns.
Well, you know, some of this stuff we've had for a long time, right? It's just most people out in the general population aren't aware of the technologies that are at play. Like when you look at like London is a good example of this, where they've fully integrated their video and audio surveillance systems citywide, where it's basically a surveillance state at this point. There have been conversations about doing it in this country, and we all know how that goes in this country. People, you know, we like our freedom in this country and don't want people looking at what we're doing. But a lot of these things have existed for a long time. It's just about iterating on them and scaling them. And you said something interesting just a moment ago. We were talking about things becoming more secure. Historically, when you have niche systems, whether that's a sensor array or whether that's a surveillance system or like a badge scanner at your office, those things, like you said, they're not secured, they're isolated, right? You will have a closed circuit system where your badge scanner relates back to a mechanical interface that then unlocks the door that has a completely closed off administration and maintenance system that doesn't connect to anything else, because we can't secure it because of how it works, so we're going to air gap it, right? The problem is it's becoming harder and harder to air gap stuff, right? Is when you look at deploying all of these systems on a large scale city, we don't have the ability in some of these cities, especially ones that are hundreds of years old, to run the level of infrastructure that we would need to support all of these things. So how do we do that? The shortest path is 5G, right? You stick a chip in it, but now it's permanently connected to the global internet, and if we haven't built in a terminal of some type into this system, it's not securable in any meaningful way, so that you have to bring in a third-party outside system to bury it in another system that can secure it, which then opens you up to other doors of like, well, what happens if that vendor that you're leveraging for that, if they have a breach of some kind? And so it just becomes this, you know, inception of how deep do we go down the rabbit hole of where does the buck stop from a security standpoint? And I think that, you know, when I was on the cyber board for Ithaca College for their graduate program during the pandemic, we talked about this kind of stuff all of the time. Like, how do you take, you know, deploying these systems in a place, and then you're working in a locality that the local government or the state government doesn't have the resources or doesn't have the cyber teams deployed to be able to do that, and then you have someone who penetrates the national grid somewhere in the middle of Connecticut, you know, where they don't have the resources of a New York City, where I'm from, or even out here on the West Coast. If you penetrate, you know, a power network somewhere in the middle of Utah, where there just aren't the same type of financial resources, but also just human resources to be able to dedicate people to be watching that stuff. And I think that's going to be what I look for as we go forward, is how do we do that at a local, state, and federal, then ultimately global level? Because if I can penetrate something in another country that is a global system where they don't have the same types of resources in play, I can still get access to you, right? So I think that's what I'm looking for.
Brian, your views?
Yes, very fascinating case. Let me complicate things just a little bit for you. And hopefully this doesn't give you an apoplexy. So let's talk about keeping the lights on. Electric utilities today have a very unique challenge. They need to take all of their existing generation, usually something like coal and natural gas, and they need to replace it with wind and solar. The utility industry spent a huge amount of time trying to make sure that the power generated equals the amount of demand for electricity. And they have to do that in every second of the day. But with wind and solar, it's much more variable. You can't do that to the same extent. So instead of trying to control generation, what the utility industry is moving to is controlling load and making sure that our devices turn off and on at the right times. There's also local solar on people's rooftops and batteries in people's homes that can be integrated with as well to predict the impact, and also to, in the case of batteries, perhaps even discharge energy back into the grid. Vehicles are going to go in that exact same way. First, all cars are going to switch over to electric. It'll probably be about 2035 before we see most of that happening here on the road, but that part's already cast in stone. Then the question is, can we productively integrate all of those resources with the utility grid to keep the lights on in a cheap, efficient manner? And so what the utilities have built is a multi-level system. It starts with what they call distributed energy resources at the bottom. That's going to be your electric cars, your smart hot water heaters, air conditioners, and eventually your Tesla Powerwalls and other energy storage devices in the home. Above that, you'll have some layer that aggregates all of those together and understands the duty cycle of each of those devices and can predict what the load is and then also control and shape that load. Above that, here's where the utilities buy very expensive software systems. There's something called DERMS, a distributed energy resource management system that talks to all the aggregators of devices and understands the layout of the distribution grid to make sure that if a whole bunch of air conditioners come on and electric cars start charging in a certain area, that we do not blow up distribution grid transformers. So that's a very important part to keep things rational. Above that, there's another software layer called ADMS that understands the transmission grid. And then you eventually get to people. And those people are the ones that are actually trading energy and keeping the lights on a daily basis. And they end up using like 5 different types of markets to do that, including, you know, even 5-minute long markets in certain areas. And so all of this is powered by the precision and accuracy that you can get by chatting with all of the devices on the grid. This is what IoT enables you to do. More cheaply operate existing systems and help survive a transition to a much more variable, flexible world.
Talking of the energy sector, Paul, you bring in a lot of experience in the energy sector. You know, Brian talked about the demand optimization part of it. There's a supply side optimization. How do you ensure that the entire energy sector is optimized for the kind of peak loads that may occur, so that we are never suboptimal, not super optimal either, and we manage this? How is IIoT is helping in this whole process?
Well, it's starting to happen. Particularly here in the US, networks are just starting to get more regulated into standardized protocols and forecasting that can be shared with other parties. So IoT is essentially a driver to that innovation, enabling third parties to participate on the network without having to be necessarily part of the large players on the network. Because traditionally this was limited to a handful of utilities in a given territory, controlling essentially all of the generation and distribution of the energy. And they used to interact with certain large generation third parties, but they were very, very few. I mean, they were very controlled, limited, because you essentially need to have a massive generation plan to be part of that ecosystem, right? With IoT, with the transformation that is happening in the network and the ability of the meters to actually not only receive energy, but push and measure energy going back to the network. The energy sector is transforming mostly I would say in the 5 to 10 years ago, but mostly in the last 5 years, into a more dynamic market where the smaller third parties can participate in very dynamic ways. And we're working on a project in that area. There are many initiatives. There are a lot of standardization happening, and a lot more will come as also regulatory bodies start understanding the implications of embracing technologies like IoT, particularly in the area of security, right? Because the problem with all of this is that you don't want to have the issue that we had a while ago, that somebody hacked into the electric network and turned off all the lights for a very, very uncomfortable chunk of the population in the East Coast, right? So that's
I was in New York for that blackout. It wasn't fun.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Walking across the Brooklyn Bridge, sleeping on the sidewalk because everything, the subways were down. Everything was down. So it's not just like people think, oh my God, I can't watch Black Mirror. But when that happened, people literally were taking their jacket and using it as, and people slept on the sidewalk that night. It was a little crazy.
So that's where this is converging, I think, is the convergence of regulatory bodies creating the frameworks that will provide a secure environment for these interactions to occur, and the technology evolution that we're working on right now to enable a more diverse, open interaction in between all of the players that will eventually even include households. And so I very soon we should be able to see my house being part of the network, and I can be negotiating whether I'm willing to sell my energy stored in my battery or not to the network on a peak. And I will then have to live with the risk of doing that transaction, let's say so, right?
Vincent,
So I just wanted to follow up on something you were saying. We're talking about, how we at scale manage these large, energy transmission. You're talking about, selling or leasing the energy that you're storing in your home or your vehicle back to the grid. But how do we deal with the outliers? That's the thing that always comes to mind. You mentioned that rolling blackout from a few years ago that hit the whole Northeast, right? But what comes to my mind when we're talking about building these systems at scale is we'll probably remember when Ted Cruz fled to Mexico a couple of years ago, and he got eviscerated in the media for it because the Texas grid was having problems, and all of us would be aware that Texas's grid is isolated, right? So how do we deal with these outliers where it's a place like Texas or other parts of the country where it's not fully on the grid, on the national grid, the outliers that are gonna, because we all know this is gonna happen, Texas is gonna refuse to play ball, as they always do. And so how do we deal with that? Because if we're putting in systems, and if you put in, large sensor arrays or power transmission systems that are built on IoT, and innovate a way to deeply secure it, so we're comfortable at the very least, we all know that there's going to be certain players that are going to refuse, right? And so how do we protect ourselves against those players that refuse to do the common sense, right? And then makes us all vulnerable. Right.
You want to add something, Brian, on this one?
Yeah. So, is anyone here from Texas?
I am, actually.
All right, very cool. So
Wasn't trying to take a shot.
a lot of the problems that Texas ran into with their power outage were caused by a lack of adequate foresight.
That's kind of the point I'm making.
You cannot foresee that cold. That was completely unexpected. They were not ready, certainly, right?
That's certainly possible. That's one way to look at it. But what was amazing was every part of the power generation system just broke down. You had natural gas wellheads and compressors that froze because they weren't actually heated in any way, or they were not protected from the elements. And they had wind turbines that also locked up because they weren't prepared to deal with ice. But if you look at a state like, say, North Dakota or even Iowa, this sort of thing is expected, and you just build the system for it. Instead, this requires a lot of vision and foresight among your regulators and people in the power industry working on resource adequacy and planning. That piece will never go away. What we do need is more accurate predictions of what the future weather conditions may be, so we understand how variable our climate will be, and so we can go and build and harden the infrastructure in the right way.
So talking about regulators, and how do you look at the role of the government alongside the private players? That is one question. And along with that, how do different technology players come together to create a very compatible overall value chain? I do believe that implementation of a large-scale technology for the utilities to give the final output has to be seamless compatibility of different technology players. How do you affect that in your industry or otherwise?
Well, I think that what we're talking about is standards, right? It is in any industry, no matter what you're doing. There are regulatory bodies, some government-led, some private, that are certification bodies that are producing tests that allow us to say that we're experts or whatever, and they're cutting the path on those standards. I also think that anyone in any vertical in technology would be aware that almost never works.
Yeah, I know.
It breaks down all of the time. I'll give you one brief example that has nothing to do with IoT, but from the AV space, right? So there is a protocol called CEC, which allows an external control device to control your television. Every television manufacturer produces a different set of standards and a different control code, which makes it impossible to deploy this at scale anywhere. And it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but it's just an example of when you have for-profit entities that have a vested interest in saying, I'm going to make my competitor's life really difficult because I want you to buy my widget instead of their widget. And so the interoperability becomes very, very difficult. And so what we need to do, not just in IoT, but the broader, technology umbrella, is we need to have some, and this is complicated because you're dealing with, a lot of world governments that, when the EU sued Apple over USB-C, for example, we need world governments to have the stones, like the EU did, to stand up to the Apples of the world and say, you are not going to do this any longer, and we're going to put regulation in your face that you're going to be forced to deal with. I think until we do that, until we can agree as a world community, which when in the history of humanity has that ever happened, right? It's going to continue to be complex, right? Because you're going to have one country regulates it this way. I mean, look at the dawn of the internet. We're still dealing with the aftermath of that 30-odd years later. That's where we got to go. Like public advocacy, policy around how are we going to secure these things? How are we going to build these things? What are the tools that are going to be at play? Until we do that, it's all moot, in my opinion.
Well, one thing to remember, and that is the underlying driver behind IoT, is simplifying the integration, not necessarily standardizing everything, because unfortunately what you're saying is just not going to happen. I mean, we will never get to an agreement amongst all the parties to have a single standard for whatever you can think of. What we can do, and what a lot of the IoT development has achieved, is move away from the proprietary, binary, non-readable standards to a open framework based on internet technologies that allows us to do integration in a very easy way, right? So it will not be as easy as saying the same exact protocol works across the board, but if I can just know that I have a consistent protocol and a very readable interface technology, it should be feasible for me to integrate all of these things, as it is right now with most of the IoT stuff. And I see it even let's take the most basic example, which is home automation. You buy equipment for home automation, and each of these vendors have built in a little piece of software that is very proprietary. But the hardware and all the technology you can buy actually cheaper from the open market with no pre-installed proprietary software, and just interact with it, right? So a lot of my friends, when end up hacking onto these devices, removing the proprietary software and just using the switch through a home automation system with open standards, right? So that is an evolution. I think we're going down that path. Standardization across the board, I don't think is going to happen, but at least we will be able to have a simpler, more consistent way to interact in between systems.
Mm-hmm. So standards are really fascinating. They are great for consumers, and they are great for anyone that builds on top of them. For the actual vendors that need to create the standard or comply with the standard, you're like, I need to spend a whole bunch of time working with all of my competitors to help bring them up to speed with my capabilities, and I'm doing this so that my customers can replace me with my competitors.
Yeah.
That is a really weird incentive for people to drive standards. And so this is exactly where we need public policy or regulators or very sophisticated customers to go help drive that process forward. So let me talk about two examples there. First, has anyone looked at smart hot water heaters? They are perhaps the most boring thing out there, and yet they have a huge amount of potential for balancing the grid and keeping the lights on, if you can turn off and on that water heater remotely. So Washington State saw that there was a standard called CTA 2045 out there for interacting with these devices. And Washington State passed a law saying all smart hot water heaters sold in the state after a certain date must include these remote control devices in them. That's incredibly powerful. It creates the ecosystem for utilities to go aggregate all of these together eventually and make sure that we gain access to a thermal storage system in people's homes. So that's one way in which governments can enable things via standards, but it does require mandates. The other version of this is the auto industry. Right now, almost all of the auto manufacturers have connected cars. So there's an app on your phone that you can use to lock and unlock the doors and do other things with the car as well. So just turn off and on the lights or even start the car. And you can start and stop charging with it. But there is no standard that the automakers have implemented there for that to fully work. There's one effort by EPRI to produce a standard. It's had somewhere between 6 and 2 automakers participating at various points over its history. Then Ford is also running a project, I believe out of Europe primarily, called Covisa, which is also to produce a standard for vehicle telematics. I have no idea which one of those is going to win or even produce a useful set of vehicles. But when that does happen, it becomes a building block that everyone can build on top of. But without any mandates for this, how is it actually going to move forward? That's unclear.
Changing gears, just wanted to delve into the topic of commercial feasibility. One of the issues I faced back in India, in a public-private overall approach towards building large internet infrastructure, they expected that to be able to carry the kind of humongous amount of broadband traffic which is required for a large cyber physical system to be able to operate. Government wanted us, the private players, to go and put infrastructure. The issue always remained is that the amount of capital deployment that you need to do, whether ever it is going to pay off for the private players. Do you see, to be able to deliver utilities, for example, things like a climate change, who takes the first step, and how does the commercial feasibility aspect comes into a discussion point? Anyone, any views?
At my company, we have taken a first step on that. We have the ability to control when cars charge, and we now have integrated a carbon emissions forecast for each utility in the US. So we can optimize car charging to save money and to use rooftop solar, but also to reduce carbon emissions. This is a great enabler for people that want to reduce their carbon footprint, whether that's homeowners or fleets or utilities. But there needs to be a strong incentive for people to do this. Many individuals may volunteer to do this, but we need systemic change to tackle a problem like climate change. And so what we need is the utilities to either take it upon themselves or to get regulated into going after these types of opportunities to reduce carbon emissions from the grid. But it does require a mandate somewhere.
Well, actually, you kind of read my mind of what I was going to talk about, is these kind of things, whenever we're talking about climate change, for example, is equal parts technology and want to, right? I mean, ultimately, like you can have, and we see this in every major city, you have people going around trying to give away LED light bulbs to try to bring down, people's carbon footprints or whatever, and some people are really, really gung-ho about, we gotta save the world, and other people are like, I want my business to run as normal, I don't wanna have to do anything different. And so it's, to your point, it's the cyber physical systems of being able to have a utility, be able to regulate and say, okay, you get this much power per quarter or whatever, or your carbon footprint cannot exceed this, or there will be a series of consequences in play. Now that might start with some sort of a fine or charging you more for your power that you receive, but it might go up and until, like if you go, like what happens if you go over your data cap on your cell phone plan? They throttle your data, right? Or they just flat turn it off, right? And so it might include being punitive to that degree. Now some of that might end up being regulatory, but the larger issue at play from what I can see is we don't have those systems in place now, right? The ability for me to say, hey, you've used more than the power that you were allotted this month, I'm going to press a button and I'm going to turn your power off. Guess what happens the minute someone does that? Massive. Yeah, exactly. The biggest class action lawsuit we've ever seen in the history of the world, right? And every lawyer in the world is going to want a piece of that, right? So it's going to be a massive thing, right? And so we don't have the culture or the infrastructure in place to be able to do stuff like that today. And so then it becomes, well, how do we get there? Do we change policy? Which we're going to have to. I think we all agree to that. But what do we do from an infrastructure place, which is where I started out this talk, to be able to do that, and how do we deploy those infrastructures? Because I think we all know in a large city, it's going to be really difficult. In the suburbs, it's less complicated to dig up the road and lay pipe, right? But in a large urban metropolitan area, where you look what's going on in Vegas this week with all the F1 stuff, no one can get around, right? Because everything is, between the sphere and everything else, everything is disrupted. You're not going to be able to do those large infrastructure grade projects easily, efficiently, or well, without massively disrupting a multi-million, millions of people in a densely packed urban area. And to do that is going to require significant capital. And that, I think, is where it comes down to, is where's the money for that coming from, right? Is it not just here in the United States, but globally, is who's supporting that initiative? What large global entity is going to be willing to pony up the dollars to say, we know we need to do this to move things forward? Who's going to foot the bill? Or which coalition of someone's is going to foot the bill? Because ultimately, am I ever going to see ROI on that? And I think we live in a capitalist society, for better or for worse. So how do we get the billionaires of the world
Yeah.
to want to do
Things,
altruistic things, because we don't live in a world where the hyper rich care about having their names on libraries anymore, right?
With
It's
a
not the way it
long-term
was.
horizon of
Yeah.
gains for them as well. Yeah.
Yeah. To that, I would add that the core infrastructure that is lagging behind right now, I think, as we get deeper and deeper into the IoT space, is communications.
Yeah.
Because people tend to feel that today's internet is fast enough. But it was never thought for real massive data transfers from hundreds of thousands of endpoints in real time. We're talking about various things that are going to be needed. We're going to need more edge computing capability to make decisions closer to the sensor. But we will also need a lot more bandwidth to transfer the data and then make sense of it, right? This is like our nervous system, right? We have our senses, but we need a good nervous system to get all of that information back to our brain. So I think there is going to be an important push in that direction. The internet, well, the telecommunication industry keeps on developing on the area, but this is going to transform the way particularly cellular networks work, because they were mainly aimed at voice and data, but not IoT type of data that has a different type of throughput and behavior as the, let's say, user browsing, right, behavior. So that's an important infrastructure aspect. In regards to what you're saying in the electric space, by the way, if we just move to time of use, that will create conscious. The problem is the industry is designed so that people don't need to think, right? So they charge you a flat fee, and essentially they bet on the fact that during peak hours they're going to lose money, but they'll recover money through the rest of the day, right? But either a time of use or time of use equivalent in terms of maximum carbon emission cost or whatever would be important to generate conscience on people that it is not the same to plug your car at 2 p.m. in the afternoon than doing it overnight, right? Because that's the worst time to do it, right? But that requires a lot more intelligence and a lot more education, right?
Well, I think something that you said that I just wanted to just springboard off of really quick in terms of like our available bandwidth. Like we saw this during the pandemic, all of a sudden the whole world was home, and all of these service providers started throttling everybody, and people started complaining, right? And I'm honestly surprised we didn't see that class action that we talked about a minute ago during the pandemic. But I think you're right. The internet infrastructure, a lot of it is significantly aged. We got to lay more pipe.
Yeah, I can vouch for that. Like, I'm from the internet industry. During pandemic, we worked 24/7 to kind of, the peak demands were just about crazy.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing the comment I wanted to make was that we don't have the systems in play to properly prioritize or filter what content is what. Like what packets are what. And so like we live in a world now where everybody is going live or consuming media content, Netflix and the like, via their cellular device globally. And our infrastructure is not built for that. It wasn't. It was built decades ago for the most part, and we just keep 3G, 4G, 5G, just keep moving up the thing, but we haven't really spent significant time thinking about how we do that in the next iteration, where you're going to have products coming out that are trying to push video at 8, 10, 12, 20K, those resolutions, and how big that data is going to be. So do we need to just build new cell towers that are only for that stuff? What do we do, right? I mean, I think it's something to think about.
Talking about the evolution and the leading edge of change, how do you think, how geared are we we discussed energy sector, we discussed automobiles, we discussed many others. What about healthcare? Are we ready for real-time polling of information to be able to dispense healthcare, robotic surgery? Are we kind of there for it? Any thoughts on that?
Well, that to me is the perfect example of the challenge in bandwidth and latency in most of these systems. You cannot rely on a system connected to the cloud somewhere in the world.
Yeah, that's true.
And even worse, going through a cellular network that is never consistent in jitter or anything like that to make a decision on whether you're going to die or not, right? I mean, so you need to transform a little in the infrastructure to support new architectures, new models that enable that. The same way when Netflix came along and the distributed data distribution networks appeared, right? So we have all of this content distribution architecture that is not centralized. It's actually a grid architecture that minimizes the bandwidth in between the cloud and the consumer so that you are just talking to the nearest access point, right? Those type of things need to evolve, but now not just for content, but for IoT to get us to the place where we can actually do these things at scale, right?
I think the challenge is, real quick, is that with that, if I can't binge The Office on a Friday night, it's not the end of my life, right? I might be annoyed, but I'll be fine. If you've got a surgeon performing open heart surgery and they have some sort of connectivity error or any kind of a glitch of any kind, someone's gonna die, right? And and when we start talking about medical stuff, the regulators wrapped around that business make it difficult. The legal system is not life and death in the same way, but it's similar. Finance, not life and death, but similar. The regulators are so stringent in those fields that we have to build things out in a more holistic and robust way. So in the medical example that you raised, that we don't have people dying on the table because of a preventable IT issue, right? And because it is life and death. And so we've got to think about this more before we deploy there, I guess what I'm saying.
So Brian, we have only 3 minutes left. Sure. Any last few thoughts?
Yeah, a lot of that comes down to picking the right problem. So you never want to hook up a pacemaker directly to the internet and have the internet tell the pacemaker how frequently to fire. But if you can instead move a lot more intelligence closer to the end user, then you can do something interesting. So something like an Apple Watch that is monitoring your health or your sleeping patterns, it can store all the data locally, analyze it to some extent, and provide some advice. And then when the cloud is available, which is probably going to be about 99.9% of the time, not 100%, but 99.9%, then it can do all the interesting processing and send all the information to the cloud. And so the more cases like that, the better off we are.
Thank you so much, all three of you, Brian, Vincent, and Paul, for your fantastic discussions. We are almost, maybe we have time for one question. If there's any question from the audience, we have last 2 minutes. Yeah, go there, to you.
So why are we being forced at a huge cost to go to electronic vehicles? Because when I have to go to an EV, right, what you said to me, what I heard was I have to give up civil liberties to drive the car and charge the car. Florida had a hurricane last year and there were, Teslas all over I-4 that ran out of power. Why can't the industry simply do what the telephone industry did? When we all got mobile phones back in the 90s, they were huge, very expensive, on a terrible network. And it took 25 years, and then the cell phone companies built their network up. I didn't have to give up anything for that. They made the phones cheaper so everybody could afford them. And I did it willingly, even though I did give up a civil liberty, because Apple knows exactly where I am. But with the EVs, what you guys are turning around and saying is, I should give up all these civil liberties. I should only charge my car when you say I should charge my car. It's still very expensive, and I have to feel guilty about it.
So, have you driven an electric car yet? Okay. I'm now on my 4th electric car, and I have to say, they're just better cars, period, than gasoline cars. The fuel costs on the gasoline side are actually pretty bad, and the carbon emissions are bad there. So there's 2 main high-level policy drivers here that are moving us towards electric vehicles. The first is climate change. We need to reduce our carbon emissions, and EVs are one way to get there. The other problem is peak oil. At some point, the rate at which we can extract oil from the ground hits some maximum, and then it's going to start declining, probably about 8% a year. That time would have happened about 12 years ago, except for shale. So the US has been largely immune to that. The rest of the world has not. At some point, our shale fields get played out. That's going to be in about 5-8 years. And so at that point, if you want to drive, it's going to be an electric car or it's going to be like a horse and buggy. So we need to start seriously thinking about that and preparing for it, and it does take, a generational shift in the vehicle technology to replace that. So about the power grid problems. The network issue about your charging networks, that is a challenge today. We need to make charging stations as commonplace and as reliable as gas stations. And one of the ways that we get there is actually open standards. Tesla's connector is the best connector, and their charging network has the best uptime of any charging network. And a lot of the automakers have now thrown in the towel and decided they're going to use Tesla's supercharger network to charge their vehicles. That's actually great for consumers, and it's going to provide a much better experience. We will get to the point where you will be happy to drive a car. It may not be, immediately, but it's coming.
I just find it funny that they kind of hide a lot of the truth behind it. You ever go to Disney, they have a huge Tesla charging station, and if you wonder how they power the Tesla charging station in Disney, it's a diesel.
It's a diesel generator, yeah.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for this.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.